Hello, and welcome to Sound Strategic. I'm Meia Nouwens, Senior Fellow for Chinese Security and Defense Policy and host of the IISS Sound Strategic podcast. The IISS convened the 21st Manama Dialogue from October 31st to November 2nd in Manama, Bahrain. The theme of this year's dialogue covered a wide range of topics, from the macro lens of global security governance to the role of diplomacy, economics, and defense in the security of the Gulf, and of course, post-conflict reconstruction in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria. In today's episode of Sound Strategic, we'll discuss the main takeaways from these key themes, in addition to examining the pivot in the US's approach to its engagement in the Middle East, the nexus of energy security and technology in the region, as well as the ongoing challenge of maritime security, particularly in the Red Sea. Lastly, we'll touch on the Manama Dialogue Young Leaders Program and what stood out to the next generation of key strategists and thinkers from the region who made up this year's cohort. Joining me to discuss these topics are four fantastic colleagues from the IISS. Air Marshal retired Martin Sammy Sampson, Executive Director of the IISS Middle East Office, who plays a leading role in organizing the annual IISS Manama Dialogue. Dr. Hasan Alhasan, Senior Fellow for Middle East Policy, Wolf Christian Paes, Senior Fellow for Armed Conflict, and Asna Wajid, Research Analyst at the IISS Middle East Office. Sammy, Hasan, Wolf Christian, and Asna, welcome onto the show. Sammy, for those who aren't acquainted with the IISS Manama Dialogue, how would you describe it?
Thank you, Meia. At its core, and quite simply, the IISS Manama Dialogue is the preeminent regional security summit in the Middle East region. It is a feature of the regional calendar now. This year, we conducted our 21st Manama Dialogue. Everybody considers it to be a very central part and central element of the security architecture in this region. We're here to promote open discussion on the most pressing regional security and defense issues, and also the sort of expression of policy responses. And to do that, we gather and assemble national leaders, ministers, policymakers from the Middle East, North America, Europe, Africa, Asia. It's a global audience and a global participation. And we have a huge number of high-level delegations that take the opportunity also to conduct bilateral and multilateral meetings throughout the period. It's a trusted platform. People come to listen, people come to speak, and most importantly and uniquely, people take the stage to be challenged. We definitely saw that this year. Two other things I might mention. There is a real opportunity for the region and the participants of the Manama Dialogue to engage with the press. They take a great interest, and oftentimes the Manama Dialogue is where headlines are made and big announcements presented in the public forum. And then finally, we invest through the Manama Dialogue in a young leaders program. Over 150 young leaders from around the region, GCC and beyond, come together. They contribute to the full dialogue as full delegates. They get to mix with ministers. And most importantly, the people who take the stage are challenged by those who are going to be leaders in the future.
I think Asna is going to give us a little bit more insight into that Young Leaders Program in a second. Manama Office plays a leading role in crafting the agenda each year for the Manama Dialogue. What were the main themes that were discussed by speakers and the audience, and were they different from what you had expected at the end of the day?
The themes for the dialogue and topics actually were written sort of 7 months before the dialogue. We pushed out an agenda, core to the IISS's principles, less about tactical commentary and more about strategic and longer term thought. So that the theme overall was regional power and statecraft amidst global change. And from that, we came up with a whole series of sessions that really explored how regional powers could adapt to global trends using the power and statecraft they currently have. Practically, how can the region shape its future and influence relationships with external powers to the benefit of the region, and vice versa? How can external powers shape their futures and influence relationships within the region? To that end, we discussed many near-term challenges and opportunities, but also looked longer term at some of the issues which drive longer term security and stability. We dived into the contemporary issues and opportunities around conflict in Gaza, political transitions in the Levant, some specific discussions about Syria under that banner, aid and assistance, clearly, the role of other regional powers, Iran, Turkey in the region, Red Sea security, because that is global security in the maritime space. That is dear and great interest and importance to many. But also this year, introducing new themes, the importance of understanding the energy security nexus and the strong interrelationship and indeed the interdependency between the roles of technology, trade, energy, and security, as well as the traditional defense issues.
As you mentioned, a large number of topics discussed and a very busy year in terms of developments within the region. So, this was the 21st Manama Dialogue. What were the atmospherics at the event?
The overwhelming atmospheric of the event was the huge interest in the region, the huge interest in understanding the challenges and the opportunities, and people sensing the importance of the moment with a ceasefire in Gaza, with a transition in Syria, with some opportunity for Lebanon, with upcoming elections in Iraq, with a calm at the moment and a desire to reset the relationship between the region and Iran. But also, there have been a number of security architectures and agreements that have been announced recently. And so the atmospherics was one of, this is a moment to see some opportunity. Potentially also, the atmospheric was one of dialogue and practical solutions. People came to talk about practical solutions. People came for dialogue to seize the moment. And that was reflected in the number of people that attended. We had over 3,500 people at the event, over 700 delegates, 65 nationalities, and a significantly increased media participation and attention, which again gives you that reach. And overwhelmingly, there was a desire and an atmosphere of the importance of dialogue and the importance of listening to others and trying to find areas of convergence. So there was a real buzz this year at the IISS Manama Dialogue, a real energy from the international community to engage.
Hasan, moving to you, what were your key takeaways from this year's IISS Manama Dialogue?
There are a couple of key takeaways, in my view, from this year's Manama Dialogue. We held a special session on conflict and post-conflict interventions in the Middle East, and that looked at the question of aid and humanitarian assistance and the transition towards early recovery and reconstruction in conflict zones, including Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. One big takeaway from that session was that the region is expected, in fact, to suffer quite immensely from cuts in the aid budgets of traditional Western donors, including, for example, and perhaps most prominently, the United States, but also France, the UK, and other advanced or developed economies. And so the expectation is that going into next year, Syria, for example, might lose up to 6% of its gross national income equivalent by way of overseas development assistance cuts, smaller but still significant impact on Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine. The region is going to be impacted heavily by cuts from or by traditional Western donors, and similarly, regional actors, including the Gulf states, who are now facing a macroeconomic environment in which oil prices are diminished and where ambitious capital-intensive projects are competing for resources. Essentially, there is less financial leeway for them to invest in post-conflict recovery and reconstruction in their neighborhood, given the demands on capital financing at home. So this was one of the big key takeaways. Another big takeaway for me was the notion that US policy in the region is driven by geoeconomic primarily and not geopolitical considerations. This is clearly how the US would like essentially to set its regional agenda, even if it keeps on getting dragged by geopolitical concerns and the need to extinguish conflicts left, right, and center. But essentially the way the Trump administration would like to build its Middle East engagement is essentially around questions of geoeconomic interest. And we've seen that translate in the fact that the US was essentially represented by the Interior Secretary, who essentially holds the pen on the US's national energy dominance strategy, and by the Deputy Secretary of Energy as well. And so a big US energy and investment focus in the Gulf, energy and investment in tech and AI. We're already seeing some of these investments from the region, both in the US, investments by national oil companies in the Gulf, ADNOC, UAE, Saudi Aramco, or Qatar Energy, placing massive investments in US LNG projects, including Golden Pass, Rio Grande, and others. The geoeconomic focus of the US agenda in the Middle East, not only with energy, but also with big ticket AI investments, are clearly, I think, where the Trump administration would like to focus, even if it gets dragged into various conflicts that I think in its mind it would like to pass on, but simply, I think, can't afford to do so.
Sticking to the geoeconomics theme, based on your recent research, what can you tell our listeners about the Gulf states' trade strategies at the moment?
The interesting data point that we noticed, the starting point of our inquiry, was that we noticed a big spike in collective GCC free trade agreements and comprehensive economic partnership agreements signed by the UAE following the onset of the US-China trade war back in 2017, 2018. The way we explain this massive spike in collective GCC preferential trade bargaining, or even in the UAE's really unrivaled drive towards signing bilateral comprehensive economic partnership agreements, or CEPAs, is that this is essentially an adaptation strategy to the global economic uncertainty caused by tensions in US-Chinese trade relations. So essentially, the Gulf states want to secure preferential terms of trade. They want to make sure that there is a degree of stability and predictability in their trading relations with key economic partners. And they want to position themselves in a favorable place whereby they can essentially act as superhighways for trade within essentially a polarized global economy. While trade frictions are being introduced left, right, and center, essentially their preferential terms of trade allow them to trade more seamlessly. And therefore, they're truly hoping to benefit from a rerouting of global trade to position themselves as connector economies.
You've already touched on the declining foreign aid budgets of traditional donors, but a lot of the discussion at the dialogue focused, of course, on the post-conflict phases in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria at the moment. Thinking about this from an Arab Gulf states perspective, what were the discussions and the main points that came out on these three post-conflict reconstruction issues with regards to prospects for participating in peacekeeping or the role of the Gulf states in reconstruction, and indeed also perhaps on a more political lens, prospects for the future of relations with Israel?
I think it's quite clear that the Trump administration has massive expectations for the role that the Gulf states will play in the transition to a post-conflict context in places like Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria. President Trump clearly expects his Gulf partners to bear the burden of reconstruction in Gaza, which has been now estimated at over $70 billion, but also Lebanon and Syria, where estimates are in the hundreds of billions of dollars. In addition to bearing the cost of reconstruction, he also expects them to shoulder much of the burden on stabilization and peace enforcement mission in Gaza, to contribute troops along with other Arab and Muslim majority nations to the peace enforcing or peacekeeping force that is expected to be mandated with peace enforcement mission in the Gaza context. There are obviously big obstacles to the Gulf states living up to those expectations, which I think are quite unrealistic. First of all, the ceasefire in Lebanon and Gaza continues to be quite shaky and uncertain. Israel continues to strike Gaza and to encroach on Lebanese territory. It continues to stifle aid into Gaza. And in the meantime, Hamas and Hezbollah are also reconstituting in Gaza and Lebanon, respectively. We don't have a clear transition to a post-conflict context. There continues to be a significant degree of violence in these contexts. The Gulf states are also quite suspicious of contributing and quite leery of contributing to a peace enforcement mission in Gaza. Hamas is highly unlikely to disarm without a clear prospect for Palestinian statehood, and Israel obviously continues to reject categorically the notion of Palestinian statehood. Contributing to a force mandated with peace enforcement in Gaza would be tantamount to going into Gaza to shoot at Palestinians and Hamas, and that's something that is going to be politically extremely difficult and unpopular for any Arab or Muslim majority state to do, and so I don't expect the Gulf states to sign on to this anytime soon. And so without a ceasefire truly in place, without a clear political horizon that would ensure a sustained resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, you're also not going to see a commitment to large-scale reconstruction, because no one wants to put in money only for that to be destroyed by yet another cycle of conflict, say in Gaza or in Lebanon. We're at an impasse where the ceasefires are not truly holding. There isn't really the conditions in place for a sustained resolution. And in that context, you're still seeing some of these armed groups reconstitute while Israel continues to wage war in Gaza and in Lebanon, albeit at a much lower level of intensity than a few months ago. Under these conditions, it's highly unlikely that you're going to see the Gulf states either volunteer forces to an international stabilization force in Gaza or commit to large-scale reconstruction in Gaza or Lebanon.
Hassan, can I be cheeky and ask one last question with regards to China? How do Gulf states look at the role of China in all of this? There's been quite little in way of active engagement by China. It likes to portray itself as a mediator and a global goods provider, but it was striking that none of these speakers from the region actually pointed to China in their remarks on stage. Is that a reflection of how they think about China's role in all of this? Or are there hopes that China can be more active, or expectations for China to be more active behind the scenes in more quiet and careful manners?
I think it's quite clear that China played somewhat of a minimal role in many of these conflicts and crises that have plagued the region over the past 2 years or so. It did at some point work with the UAE at the UN Security Council to push forward language that it considers to be somewhat pro-Palestinian. It did try to broker some kind of agreement between the various Palestinian factions, but that didn't seem to go very far. The Chinese have largely taken a backseat. They have, I think, neither the appetite nor really the human capacity either, in terms of their understanding of the region and vested interest in the region, to be engaged in some of these conflicts. I don't think that they see it as being in their interest to do so. There's only really a downside for them in getting more involved. In a sense, they're not truly an important player when it comes to these geopolitical issue areas. Even in the Red Sea, it was clear that the Chinese struck their own deal with the Houthis, but were not really interested in playing a larger role in resolving some of these tensions. On the geopolitical side, I think the Chinese role is not very significant, but on the economic and trading side, they are seen as a much more predictable, reliable, and steady partner than, say, the United States, where the US's erratic trade policies have caused quite a lot of uncertainty. Not much of a geopolitical role, but I think on the trading side of things, seen as more reliable given the volatility that we see in US policy at this juncture.
Thank you. Wolf Christian, turning to you, what were the highlights of this year's IISS Manama Dialogue for you? What did you take away from the conference?
Thank you, Meia. I think there's a couple of points that really stand out for me. And one is that we get a little bit more clarity about where US policy making is coming from in the region. And we've already heard about the high-level delegations joining us and also their specific focus, which was very much on sort of interior and energy issues rather than the typical foreign policy military focus that used to dominate their agenda in the region. We had a couple of really interesting speeches by the likes of Tulsi Gabbard, the National Intelligence Director, or Tom Barrack, the Special Envoy to the Middle East. And they really stressed that the US thinks the answer is economic development. Basically, the logic goes something like that. More development will lead to more prosperity will lead to peace. That's quite a break compared with the previous nation building containments agendas, which were fairly heavily militarized and where it was more about taking a clear side in these discussions. So in a sense, this could be read as a bit of a disengagement from the region in terms of agenda setting. That caused quite a bit of a stir among the delegates from the Gulf region. I recall one discussion we had at the Young Leaders Forum, where we spoke about sort of strategic challenges for the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, and going forward. One point that really came out was, can we still trust the US and their security guarantees? And that's, of course, heavily triggered by the incident in Doha when Israel attacked representatives of Hamas in Doha. In a sense, strategically, there is a bit of head scratching going on, I think, in the region. Do we need new alignments? Do we need new allies? Do we need new partners? Interestingly enough, and I'll leave it at that, this is somewhat similar to the discussion which we have in the European Union at the moment, right? So there are some similarities. I mean, both regional organizations have, of course, relied on US protection very heavily, enjoyed the fruits of that economically, that basically somebody else is taking care of your security needs. The price for that was, of course, there wasn't a lot of strategic autonomy at either the GCC level or the EU. There might be some scope for realignment here in the future.
There was a special session focused specifically on security sector reform in post-Assad Syria at the dialogue this year. What can you tell our listeners about that discussion?
Syria was certainly one of the priorities of the dialogue in general, both at the special session, but also during the plenary discussions. We presented some of our findings. The IISS put out a paper recently on prospects for security sector reform in post-Assad Syria. And we discussed with the Syrian government, but also with a number of partners from other governments, with German representatives, British representatives, and others, about what role, if any, the international community can play to make this work. The basic challenge here is that 11 months in after the fall of the Assad regime, security sector reform is still really at a very early stage. So basically, they decided at the end of 2025 that all the rebel opposition groups would now become part of the new military of the new Syria. Basically, the old army has been disbanded by decree of the new government. A new one will be formed. But the question is, how do you really do that? And at the moment, it's basically been a relabeling. All these forces now are supposedly under the Ministry of Defense, but in actual fact, they continue to operate pretty much as before, have their own structures. Some of them have their own sources for income, different equipment, and all of that. And the question is now, how can you form a coherent military force out of that, and one that is secular in nature? Because we've seen both in Latakia in March on the coast, the Syrian coast, and in Asweda in the south, and June and July, what happens if you have a sectarian force trying to maintain public order in minority areas. And in both cases, that led to horrific incidents of sectarian violence. There is a broad shared understanding that something needs to be done about it, but so far, comparatively little has been done, and we hope to contribute with our little side event to progress in this area.
And lastly, maritime security in the Red Sea also featured in the plenary sessions. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about those discussions?
Maritime security in this part of the world remains a major challenge. Merchant ships in November 2023, people have gotten very nervous about supply lines, about the ability to access the Suez Canal. And a lot of countries have been suffering economically. First of all, Egypt, which has lost as much as half of its channel revenue in a situation where the economy isn't doing very well to start with. Everyone really is trying to come to terms with the question of how to address this. And so far, military interventions haven't really helped, neither the attempts to protect European shipping by Aspides, nor the attacks that both Israel and the United States have flown against Houthi targets, spending a lot of money, a lot of kit, trying to suppress the Houthi threat, and yet the Houthis continue to attack ships and, of course, also to attack Israel. During the dialogue, we had a passionate speech by the foreign minister of Cyprus, who said, well, we really need to do much more as Europeans in this part of the world. We need to form new partnerships and do more about this. Yeah, obviously, given that Cyprus has a large maritime interest in these waters, I think they have the third largest merchant fleet. The question that then came up very quickly during the discussions is where the warships supposed to come from to protect merchant shipping, right? We had high-ranking NATO representatives, and they've basically said, we don't have enough ships at our disposal. If you have only a limited number of ships, question whether you send them to the Baltic Sea, to the North Atlantic, or the Red Sea, you need to prioritize. And from a European and from a NATO perspective, defense of the alliance is priority number one. Basically, there are not enough ships going around to do more in the Red Sea. And that led then to a discussion about how we really need a political solution for this problem. There are no standalone military solutions.
Hasna, turning to you, we already heard from Sammy a brief overview of the Manama Dialogue Young Leaders Program. Can you tell us in brief the makeup of this year's cohort? Who were the young leaders? What's their background? How diverse is the group at this year's event?
Hi, Mia. Thank you. The Manama Dialogue Young Leaders Program is an initiative that was launched by the IISS in 2019. This year's cohort consisted of 27 young leaders from 9 countries, including the GCC states plus Egypt, Morocco, and Jordan. 48% of them were women. And historically speaking, the split has been very even. Last year, we had 54% of female participation. And in terms of their backgrounds, there is a diverse professional professional backgrounds that they come with. This year we had diplomats, analysts, researchers, as well as private sector representation.
Anyone that's been to the Manama Dialogue in the past, or indeed also the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore that's held every year, knows that our young leaders always ask the sharpest and the thorniest questions to our speakers on plenary sessions. What were the topics that they were most concerned about and engaged on in these discussions this year? What mattered most to them?
For this year, we decided to change the agenda, making it more interactive and exposing the young leaders to, for example, questions on how geopolitics impacts business operations, prompting discussions amongst the young leaders on a micro level on the impact of local politics on global business operations and how cultural nuances are often factored into decision-making processes. We also arranged a horizon scanning exercise for the young leaders, which essentially looked at the top security threats facing the GCC in the next 10 years. And this enabled the young leaders to discuss key environmental, economic, technological, and political military threats facing the region, which was facilitated by our IISS experts. And this enabled fruitful dialogue on the interlinkages between these threats and how might they be mitigated in the future. We also had the young leaders discuss with senior decision makers about how they think of information as a tool of modern conflict, employed both by states and non-state actors, and how misinformation and disinformation campaigns that are being launched are becoming increasingly destabilizing to the regional security landscape. And finally, this year, the young leaders had the opportunity to engage on a more practical level with regional practitioners and discuss navigating career pathways in the Middle East. So this allowed them to face concrete examples and listen to advice, which we hope would enrich them in their journeys going forward. And of course, as you highlighted, the questions, the ones that are the most thought-provoking and insightful do come from these young leaders, which was a pattern that we saw repeat again this year. This really comes with the platform that they are offered to engage with these senior level policymakers, heads of states, ministers of foreign affairs, especially this year. This gave them this opportunity to really ask the hard questions, ask the questions nobody else really wants to ask. We really appreciated this from them this year.
And if I can ask one last question similar to what I asked Sammy, what were the atmospherics within the young leaders group? Do you think they were hopeful? Were they optimistic? Or were they really focused on the challenges of the region and putting those challenges to the policymakers to ask clarifications on?
It was truly a blend of optimism with caution because they wanted to know what are the practical steps that are being taken with the most pressing situations facing the region. They wanted to know how these senior level policymakers are going to grapple with topics ranging from misinformation and disinformation campaigns and the impact this has on regional security, as well as what is being done to better economically integrate the GCC, for example. They were really posing the most intriguing questions and wanting to know how the landscape will look like in the region going forward.
Excellent. That's all we have time for today. So thank you, Asna, Wolf Christian, Hasan, and Sammy for sharing your insights. And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. You can find more information on the topics discussed in today's episode in our show notes. If you weren't able to join this year's IISS Manama Dialogue, you're in luck. You can access recordings of all the plenary sessions and related research and analysis on the IISS website at iiss.org. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. Thank you and see you next time.